All right, so we got our Hello World working, and now I'm sure you're super excited. You're like, wow, I got React working, but what do I do next, right? Teach me about, what it is that makes this different from writing regular JavaScript. And by the way, why do I have to write all this stuff in an app.js? Here's an index.js, and what is this CSS, and this test.js, and what are all these other files like service worker, setup tests, and all that. So we'll get to all that, I promise. All right, we'll get through them in stages. For now, let's just keep our attention at app for now, because in web development, especially in the last, I guess 5-6 years, people have started calling web development app development. And it kind of makes sense because a lot of people doubled from doing web development as iPhone developers or Android developers. And in that world, they call software apps. So taking that same, vernacular, like that lingo, basically they said, all right, we're going to code apps also for the web. And so that's where this whole terminology of app came from. You're still making a website at the end of the day. But the nice idea is that if you learn React, one of the ideas that I guess the Facebook team has is if you learn React, you can take this knowledge that you have and take that same, building style over and port it to, an iOS app or an Android app using React Native. So we'll eventually get there. I'll probably have a playlist for you about what React Native is. But that said, yeah, just these are the skills that you want to build now, the foundational skills, so that later on, when you become a better programmer, you have these foundational skills that can, lead you to doing even more cool things. You can still use JavaScript at the end of the day too. Like if you really like JavaScript and you just want to stay in that world and just use jQuery and all that, that's fine. My whole take on that though is that eventually things kind of get outdated, and if the industry is not going to use it, it probably is going to go away. I don't know if you know about the whole Flash thing, but for a long time, Flash sort of dominated the web. Maybe 10 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, Flash was this big thing. I don't think it was that long ago, but Flash was definitely dominant on the web for a long time. And, it's rare now to meet Flash developers because nobody wants to work on Flash, right? Everybody wants to work on HTML5. And so that's kind of how things are going anyway. Anyway, it's a little bit of a tangent. We'll have a video on that as well if you're really interested. I'm going to bring your attention back to this anyway. So you want to work in app, the function app, right? That is kind of the main entry point for building your website. And you'll notice that a lot of these statements come from ES6. So ES6 is all about, at the end of the day, ES6 is all about JavaScript modules. And what that means is essentially libraries that you can import and export. And that's a huge jump from ES5. So if you're interested, I have a course on it and you can check it out. I'm going to put the link down there. And essentially, if you're really interested, you can check it out. I also have a playlist on it. I'll put a card as well. But this is the way web development works in modern 2020. You import and then you export. So you create all your functionality here in a local file called app.js. And then you export whatever code you want. Here we're saying we want to export this function. And that is going to get grabbed up by React and injected into our JavaScript DOM, essentially the web page, right? The DOM is an API that you can use with JavaScript to insert your code into a web page. So if I were to right click on this particular page and view the page source, you'll see that somewhere here I have a div with an ID called root. And so if you look at this, if you've ever kind of looked at HTML web pages, you'll notice there's a lot of code, especially a lot of HTML blocks. But with React pages and a lot of app.js kind of pages that use this app structure, there is no HTML code. It's kind of where to go? Where to go? So you have to use the inspector, which you can do by right-clicking and then looking for the inspect tool if you're on Chrome or Safari or Firefox. And then if you look here, you can see that inside the root is my div hello world, right? It's not here if I view the page source. And that's because JavaScript, again, is injecting the HTML that we write dynamically into our page. And so that's a huge, huge jump from, doing server-side web development where you would see the code that you would write printed on the page the next time you visit, which, I know that can throw a lot of people off, but that's kind of like how it is working now. So here, when I look at this React DOM.render method, this is a special method that comes from the React library. Actually comes from the React DOM library. And essentially, it takes your code and then it bundles it in with app, right? App is just a function. But you'll see that instead of using this function statement that we exported, you have a tag that looks like HTML. And this is for convenience. The people behind React, essentially they started off by creating JavaScript functions that you could use to create HTML. And that was always the thing that you could do with JavaScript. You could create HTML with JavaScript. It was really nice. But it got really annoying over time to write functions and functions and functions and functions. People just wanted to, stick with something easier like HTML. What about HTML? HTML is easy. Just write like tags and then put whatever you want inside of it. So Facebook created this syntax called JSX, which looks like HTML, but is actually just a placeholder for injecting React JavaScript functions. And so we'll get into that as well. I'll do a little example of how that works. But essentially, you have to remember at the end of the day, you're really writing JavaScript. You're not writing HTML, even though that's what this looks like. This is actually JSX. And remember, under the hood, there's a lot of stuff going on underneath the hood, especially Webpack, Babel. So this code that you write here is being transpiled in real time too, because that's what's going on with this development server. It's being transpiled in real time, rebundled, and then ported up here for code that your browser understands right now, because most browsers, Chrome does a better job of it, so it understands more ES6 syntax, but a lot of older browsers don't really understand all this React stuff. So if you try to just write React in a simple web page and then try to run it on your browser, nothing will happen. You'll just get a JavaScript error. So in summary, right, we need to work in an app.js file or a file that we're going to make the center point of our application. Because we use the create-react-app script from NPM, the point of entry is the app function, and then your code would go somewhere here. And then you're going to import libraries like React and the React DOM to basically inject your code, application code, with the React DOM render. And that ports your code and then fires it up here, and underneath the hood it's still a JavaScript function. So those are things you're going to have to remember over time. If this is really complicated for you, I really suggest taking notes, especially writing things down, or maybe replaying the video at certain points so you kind of get it, more, make it easier for yourself to understand. And then, yeah, I love flashcards, so I'll use flashcards quite often. I'll use digital flashcards, so I use Anki, and I like that website a lot. I'm just going to plug for them, even though I don't get anything for it. But yeah, you can use this. This is a really good tool that I use just to plug in a lot of stuff that I don't understand, and then it'll drill stuff for me later, and I'll be like, oh, okay, that's what it was. And the more I see it, the more I become familiar with it. And that's the same thing I would say for you. If you're not familiar with stuff, just make flashcards. So yeah, okay. One more thing before we go to the next video, right? I mentioned that here's where you want to just edit your code. You can also add more code here. So I can say function header, and I can just say return a header. And the reason I'm typing like this, by the way, is just because that's the thing that you do in React. This is the way React works. You use functions, or you can use classes to return JSX elements. That's kind of the best practices that they use. So I'll do one more here, and I'll say return a footer, and So we'll just put some stuff in here, dummy content. And by the way, I want to use lowercase so that React knows that I'm returning basic HTML. This is the header. Okay, so save that. You'll notice that nothing happened here because I didn't actually put them in the app, right? So that's kind of like the main thing. If you build these functions, they're not going to get used unless you put them in the point of entry, the app. So in order for us to do that, we would need to call the function, or we can use JSX syntax, and we can just bring it in here like a placeholder almost. And if I save this now, oh, I got an error, and that is because we need to wrap everything in a parent element. So let's put a div here and save this, and there you go. There's the header, there's the hello world, and there's the footer. Now you might be thinking, well, why did you need to wrap everything inside of a div? What was the point of that? Well, that's because, remember, again, even though this looks like HTML, it's not really. It's saying that we want to create an element and its components or its children should be these things. By default, when you use React, it's saying create a header. React create element header, then inside is going to be this content. So if you've ever remembered, vanilla.js, inner text or inner HTML, so that would be that what gets plugged in there. And then basically any, anything that I wanted to add as far as like extra parameters to a JavaScript function. So like name, address, whatever, right? All of those can be considered extra props, right? We'll get into that too. I'll do a better explanation of what that means. But so when you're creating all this, you're actually just saying React, and I believe it's create element header, and then I'm going to say this is the header. And I believe the syntax is actually like this. So let's see here. It says, does my Visual Studio Code do a good job of telling me? Well, let's see. I'm just going to pass null here because I don't have anything as props. So I'm just going to say React create element header, and let's see. Does that work? Yeah, it still works. So this is the header. So remember, that's the key point here. That's really what I want to point you to. You're actually returning JavaScript functions, but nobody likes doing that, especially as you build more complicated like functions, right? Like this React create element goes here, this one goes here. Nobody likes doing that. So it's just easier to write HTML. And that is what JSX is. And so at the end of the day, when you return, you need something to wrap all of this into one simple function. So we're saying we just want to create a div, and then inside we want to place all of this extra stuff. So we're going to create another React element function, and then put in a header, then another one, and then create a div called hello world. And we're also going to have the footer as well. And actually this isn't wrapped, but this is part of the entire syntax. So imagine like 4 different React create element functions inside of a big giant React create element functions, or maybe it's 3. That is just going to be really cumbersome to write. So rather than do all that, we can just say return header HTML. So if you're really interested in the JSX syntax, I really do recommend going over to, let's see here, I can just do a search for JSX, and I can do React.js, and I think that would bring up the Facebook documentation about what exactly JSX is and how you can use it. So I definitely recommend reading that if you have extra time. And the last thing that I'll throw at you before we close the video is you no longer have to write HTML in one place. You never have to write HTML again in multiple places that do the same things. You can just create this particular HTML component one time, and then anytime you want to reuse the header, you can plug it in wherever you like in your code, as many times as you like, and that will update your code here on this side. So I think that's like a huge convenience for why somebody should use React over just writing stuff in regular HTML and CSS and JavaScript. It's because you can build one time and then port that code to basically anywhere and never have to worry about like trying to find where is it in all these different project files and folders. You know, how many times did we reference the header? How many times did we reference the footer? It's just in one single file. And as your project grows, you can move this to its own file called header or footer. And then it makes your entire workflow much easier and cleaner. So hope you like this tutorial, and I'll see you in the next one.